Hey everybody, Jeff Schneider here, and today we're talking about practicing and motivation. If you've been playing music for a long time, I'm sure you've had those days where practicing feels like a chore. It feels like the last thing you want to do, which is kind of weird because if you think back to the very first days of you playing your instrument, practicing was probably one of your favorite things to do. You looked forward to doing it. So what happened? When did practicing become work? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about how to build that motivation back up so practicing is not such a chore. It's something that you look forward to doing so that you can get better at your instrument and play the kind of music you want to play. So before we get into the practical strategies, let's talk about practicing and motivation because we have to get clear on what those two things are before we can dig into how to build the motivation back up. So practicing is, to be clear, not playing. It's not playing. There's a reason there are two different words for practicing and for playing. Practicing is what we do to prepare to play. It is sharpening these individual tools that we can then use to create something. And if your tools are dull, then it's going to be really hard to create something when you're going to play, when you're performing. Sometimes that work can be engaging and enjoyable, and sometimes it can feel like quote unquote work, which is the negative connotation. What about motivation? Motivation, of course, is the drive that compels us to take action. And we can break motivation down, at least for the purposes of this video, into two categories. We've got intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is the motivation that it comes from within. So it's the joy of doing something. You feel fulfilled by the action. You don't need any sort of outside forces to get you to do something. You just do it because you want to do it. Extrinsic motivation is motivation that comes from external sources. It could be some sort of consequence if you don't practice. So now that we're clear on what practicing is and on what motivation is, let's talk about how to get and stay motivated. Now the first way is do it now! It's to suck it up and just practice. It's the David Goggins approach to getting the work done.
Stay hard!
Don't worry about psyching yourself up. Don't worry about tricking yourself into wanting to do it. You just do it. That's option one. And that can work for some people. But if that's not working for you and you need a more nuanced strategy, we're going to talk now about how to nurture that intrinsic motivation, that internal desire to actually want to do this thing called practicing. All right, so let's rewind the clock again, and I want you to think back to when you first started playing music. Why was practicing so enjoyable back then? Why was it something you looked forward to doing? Well, there are two main reasons. The first is that when you started out, and when you start out with anything, the progress you make is clearly evident. You're starting from zero. You're starting from nothing. So all that progress you're making is clear as day. You can recognize your progress. And that right there, that evidence of progress is one of the main sources of intrinsic motivation. The thing is, as you get better, the progress becomes less evident. You know, I tell my students sometimes that getting to that 99% of their potential is the easy part. That can take a few years, but getting from 99% to 100% of your potential, that's where you spend the rest of your life. You never get to that 100% because you can always make these incremental improvements, but they're harder to recognize. It's harder to be aware of that progress as you get better and better. And that's why sometimes you'll hear people hit these plateaus or they'll get into slumps. And really what that is the lack of evidence for progress. So what you can do is counteract that lack of evidence because there still is progress. You're just not aware of it because it might be more subtle. So you have to make it less subtle. There are a few ways of doing that. The first and most effective way is to keep a practice journal. And it doesn't have to be like a diary where you're writing down your thoughts about your practicing. All you have to do is write down what you're working on and quantify how you're doing with it. The best metric there is tempo.
Not quite my tempo. It's all good. No worries. Here we go.
So you write down, okay, I'm practicing this scale or this pattern at 60 beats per minute today. And then when you go to practice tomorrow, you can see, okay, I'm able to play it now at 66 beats per minute. And you can note that. And seeing that progress is going to give you the motivation to keep going because you'll have this evidence that you're actually getting better. It's just like if you're working out at the gym and you're writing down the amount of weight that you can lift or how fast you can run. Writing down your exercises, recording your tempos makes a huge difference. Speaking of recording, another great way of tracking your progress is by making recordings of yourself. Record yourself regularly. Doesn't have to be long. A minute long is fine. And then listen back a week later and hear how your playing has changed. This works especially well if you're recording yourself doing a specific exercise because, as I said, when you're practicing, you want things to be controlled. You want to isolate different problem spots and work on the same thing multiple days in a row. And you can hear the progress, literally, you can hear it by listening back to a recording of yourself a few days earlier or a week earlier. For any of you that have kids out there, you know that it's harder to see your kids grow because you're with them every day. But for those relatives that see them once every 2 years, they see this massive growth because they're not living with your kids every single day. The same is true for practicing. If you're practicing every day, you're living with your playing every single day. And so it's harder to note the growth because you're always hearing it. You need to create some distance, and recording yourself is a great way to do that because you can listen back to how you sounded 3 weeks earlier and you'll hear objectively that you've gotten better. And again, that evidence of progress will build intrinsic motivation for you to keep going because you know all this hard work that you've been putting into this thing is actually paying off. You're actually getting better. Now, the other reason practicing was more enjoyable when you started out was because it was new. There was novelty there. And you can introduce that novelty back into your playing by switching something up. Even practicing in a different room or practicing outside or practicing with a different setup with some different gear. Anything to make it more exciting with newness can be effective in building up that intrinsic motivation because it'll just make the process more enjoyable. The experience will be more enjoyable. And now that I think about it, there's actually a third reason for why practicing was something you looked forward to doing way back when, and that's because you were inspired. So you can reignite that inspiration, and one of the best ways to do it is by going to see live music. Seeing live music, at least for me, inspires me to pick up my instrument and do the work because I have this goal right in my face of, okay, I want to be able to do that. And that is the feeling that we had when we first started. We saw somebody play or we heard somebody play and we thought to ourselves, I don't know how they're doing that, but I want to be able to do that. And you want to recreate that feeling in you. And you can do it by going to see live music. All right, so those are some strategies for building up that intrinsic motivation, but you can also lean on extrinsic motivation. And that comes down to one word: accountability, and there's different forms of it. All right, so the first iteration of accountability that I want to bring up here is mutual accountability, which is just a fancy way of saying get a gym buddy. So when you go to the gym, one of the best ways to get yourself there is by having a gym buddy, and you can have a practice buddy too. I have a practice buddy. Twice a week, my friend Jake and I meet on Zoom, and we practice guitar for 20 minutes. It's a real low commitment, but we know that we both have to show up on this day at this time. And so even when other things are, on the to-do list, we know we have to sign on and practice guitar for 20 minutes. It really works. So find a practice buddy. It doesn't have to be in person, though that can be great. And then you can work on exercises together. I've done that too. But if you don't have anybody nearby, Zoom is a great resource. Just sign on, go on mute, and you can actually play for each other after the practice session what you were working on. And it's kind of like a mini recital of demonstrating your skills. If you want to double down and include some of that other stuff I was talking about, you can record those practice sessions or those mini performances at the end, and that will help you track your progress. So that's mutual accountability. There's also public accountability. And that's like declaring to your social media friends that you're going to practice 20 minutes every day or something like that. You make some sort of declaration or statement that you're going to practice X amount of minutes for X amount of days. And it's a way of keeping yourself accountable or holding yourself accountable by making it known to your friends and your family, or people online, whatever the case may be, that can work really well as well. Lastly, we have social accountability, which is, I think, one of the most powerful ways of building up that extrinsic motivation. And social accountability comes in the form of, say, like a gig that you have coming up and you want to sound good at the gig, or you commit to attending a jam session next week and you want to sound good at the jam session, or at the very least, you don't want to sound bad. Sure, it's great to be motivated because you want to do it, but there's also something to be said for not wanting to sound bad. And whatever works, if you're desperate and you know you should or need to be practicing, these techniques can be powerful in getting, like I keep saying, getting your butt in the chair, practicing your instrument. This isn't so much about motivation, but it's to remove the resistance to practicing, and that is to make practicing easy. And I don't really mean like make the exercises easy, or that can be related to this. What I'm really talking about is what James Clear talks about in his book, Atomic Habits, which I highly recommend. He talks about making the act of whatever you want to do, the habit, make it easy by keeping your instrument easily accessible. Or if there's something that distracts you, like your phone, put it in a drawer in a different room, or just turn it off altogether. Remove the resistance and make the thing you want to do as accessible as possible. That can make a big difference. Also, think about what that first action step would be to actually practice. Like, is it taking your reed out of the reed case, picking up your guitar, sitting down at the piano bench? It's the smallest action that will give you the least resistance. Sure, if you think, okay, I got to go practice for 2 hours, that's a daunting task. But sitting down on a bench, not such a big deal. Again, going back to the gym analogy, maybe you've heard of the best way to get to the gym is just by putting on your gym shoes. It's that first step to get you to where you want to be. Last but not least, when it comes to what you're actually practicing, make sure that you're choosing material that is challenging. You don't want it to be overwhelming. You don't want it to be too easy that it's boring. You've got to find that sweet spot. And one of the best ways of doing that is by looking for the baby steps. Say you're working on a scale at 60 beats per minute. You're not going to then jump to 140 beats per minute once you can do it at 60. You've got to find those incremental adjustments to get you to 140. So you do 60 beats, maybe you do 65 beats per minute, then 70, and so on. Now that's a really simple way of finding the baby steps in between those larger jumps. Sometimes you have to get more creative. Maybe it means instead of working on the entire phrase, you work on just the first couple of beats, and then the next couple of beats, and then you put those together and you have a whole measure. You have to get creative with finding those baby steps, but that will help you dial into that sweet spot of where it's not too easy and not too hard. That can make all the difference and get you into that flow state where practicing is something that you enjoy doing, and it'll make you feel good when the practice session is done, which will then encourage you and motivate you to do another practice session the next day. You want to build up these positive experiences, and if the practicing feels like work in the moment, then when you go to think about it for the next time, you're only going to associate with those feelings that you had previously, and it's going to make it that much harder to sit down and practice again. So make sure that your practice sessions are effective, enjoyable, and that comes down to choosing the right material and making sure that you're practicing smart and not just hard. All right, so if you want to learn more specific techniques on how to improve your practicing and make your time in the shed more efficient and more effective, I have an entire course called Perfect Practice, which you can check out. It's linked in the description below and on the screen somewhere. I also have courses on how to solo, no matter what skill level you're at or what instrument you play. And if you're more into playing chords and in the jazzy R&B style, I have a whole piano course as well that you can check out. It's all in the description below. And remember, no matter what you choose to work on, it is work. Practicing is work, but that doesn't mean it needs to feel like a chore. Enjoy the process, enjoy the work, build that motivation back up, and you're gonna love the way you sound after you stick with it, because there's nothing like playing the way you wanna play. Practicing is the way to get there. Keep it up, happy shedding, and thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.